actually book meetings. We've had good success this year, and we hope to continue into next year. The author I'm going to introduce here is Paul Griner, who's a professor at the University of Louisville, teaches creative writing. He has an interesting history himself. Graduated from University of New Hampshire, but he has a master's degree in Romance languages from Harvard, then a master's in creative writing from Syracuse, and that's a famous writing program, by the way. I don't know if you know. As far as I know, this book is what, your third book? And,
yes, I think so, third and sixth so far.
And you had, three since then, and so forth. This is published by Soft Skull Press, which is out of New York City, so forth. So I don't know if you had a chance to take a look at the book or not. On the back, one of the critics mentioned Mary Roach, which seems to be apt to this, because she's written books about corpses and what happens after life and that type of thing. But with that, I'll shut up and let Mr. Griner tell you about his book.
All right, well, thank you, Mark, for that introduction, and thank you, Valerie, for inviting me. Thank you all for coming out. I know you guys are busy. And I do have to apologize. When we set this up, I was teaching on Mondays and Wednesdays, and then they changed my schedule, and now I'm teaching Thursdays. So I actually have a class at 1. I'll get there. I'm not worried about it. But I thought what I do is just first I'll read the entire book aloud, and then if there's time after that, we can talk a little bit. I'm going to give a very short reading, and after that, I'll talk a little bit about the origins of the book, and then open it for questions. And personally, both as a writer and as an audience member, the older I get, the less interested I am in the actual reading aloud part of a reading, and much more with a question and answer. So anything is fair game. I'll just read a page or so, sort of set the tone. Okay. Her body is missing. What? I said, still waking up, the darkness humming around me. I shifted the phone to my other ear, thinking I'd misheard. Leah's body, it's missing, Mrs. Stefanini said. Can you help Elena, please? The normal question would be, how does a body go missing? But I'd been in the business long enough to know that bodies often did. Once someone died, all kinds of things could happen. After the family left, if there was a family, a nurse or an attendant took the body down to the morgue on a service elevator so the public wouldn't see it. An understandable sleight of hand, commendable even. The body was trundled off to the morgue in a mostly silent last walk, signed in and left. The diener had it then, and I'd been a diener, so I knew the routines that followed. The paperwork, the cleaning of the body, the autopsy, and the phone calls. To an undertaker if one had been specified, to the coroner if there had been a crime, to the med school if interns and med students needed to practice intubation and catheterization, to the body brokers if the body wasn't claimed. None of that for Leah, it seemed, save perhaps the body broker. Still, I was surprised that Mrs. Stefanini had called. I hadn't known that Leah was dead, for one thing, and I hadn't heard from the Stefaninis for 3 years. And the last time I had, Mrs. Stefanini herself had told me never to call again. Okay, so that's just the opening of the book. And I printed out one other thing to read very briefly. It was from one of my hometown papers in Boston. And this is the opening 5 paragraphs of a news story. Upon arriving at James Knott's apartment Tuesday to execute a search warrant, FBI agents asked the Kentucky man if anyone else was home. Only my dead friends, Knott allegedly replied. Inside, federal investigators say they found about 40 human skulls, spinal cords, femurs, and hip bones strewn about. The skulls were decorated around the furniture, one FBI agent wrote in an affidavit filed in federal court this week. One skull had a headscarf around it. One skull was located on the mattress where Knott slept. Also found inside the home, a Harvard Medical School bag. This was a story that broke just a couple of months ago about the Harvard Medical School and the way they had disposed of bodies that had been left to them for study by doctors. 2 days ago, a story broke about a Denver burial company. I use the term loosely. They have been taking bodies since 2019 and were supposedly disposing of them in humane and environmentally conscious ways, what that actually meant was that they had a big warehouse that they put all the bodies in and just left them. And a neighbor started to smell the bodies and call the cops, and they knocked on the guy's door, and he said, "Oh yeah, I'm a taxidermist, and I know there's a problem there. I'll meet you tomorrow to let you in." And then he left. They only found him in Oklahoma afterwards, and he was arrested. So the reason I bring those up is that the issues that this book talks about are still really prevalent. I'm sure most of you know, many of you are probably lawyers and you know a lot more about the law than me, but organ donation and transplant stuff is really highly regulated. The rest of the body it's pretty much fair game if you can get it. And parts, if you sold all the constituent parts of a body, you could make over $250,000 per course. There's an enormous black market for it. People need skin on burn wards, especially women, sometimes men, they get collagen injections. That comes from skin. So there's actually a tool for shaving skin off a body. And when I learned about that, when I was doing my research, I'd be watching a lot of YouTube videos, like how do you dismember a body? And one of my sons would walk into my office and he'd say, "You know, the FBI is gonna come and they're gonna arrest you." And I'd always tell him, "Don't worry, Trev, I logged in as you." And the way I actually started researching this, it wasn't like I had these fantasies of dismembering bodies. I was writing another novel called The German Woman, and I heard about, I don't know if any of you remember a guy named Alistair Cook. He used to be the host on Masterpiece Theater, PBS, British guy, very elegant and etc. And about 10 years after he died, I read that he was in the news again because it turned out his body had been plundered. It was a guy who was a dentist who lost his license because of drug addiction and then turned to body brokering. And there's, as I said, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry in the US and abroad yearly. And so this guy was making, forgive the pun, a killing on, taking bodies, dismembering them, and selling part. Surgical conferences need bodies, so surgeons can practice the new therapy, new surgical practices on shoulders or hips or buttocks or whatever. And sometimes stuff is kind of comical. I mean, there was an entire trailer of human buttocks that were going to a plastic surgery conference in Miami, and the truck broke down. And so the state police were investigating, and they opened up, and there's 500 buttocks in there, and they're trying to figure out what's going on. But since I was doing another novel at the time, I sort of put it aside, and I came back to it gradually and did a bunch of research. And at that point, I'd been living in Kentucky for about 20 years, so it was the first time I actually felt comfortable setting something in Kentucky. All my other stuff had been set in the Northeast, where I'm from. I drove around places looking for where, to set it. I never bothered explaining to people why I was poking around, because I figured they'd think it was kind of strange. And then, I wrote the book, and usually, the book I had been working on, The German Woman, that one, my first novel took me 6 weeks to write. The German Woman, which was my second novel, took me 10 years. And this one was somewhere in the middle. I sent it to my agent. She said, "Oh, I like this, I don't like that, etc." I went through a bunch of things. And then, finally I got it published, which always makes me happy. And it was interesting to see the responses to it. My agent tells me that a lot of people have asked her, like, "Is he a little strange?" And she said, "No, he's really nice, he's got a family, etc." It's a dark book, because it's a dark world, and to write it, I had to sort of inhabit that world mentally, at least, and it was an odd experience, but it did. It gave me an enormous appreciation for the work so many doctors do, a lot of lawyers do in trying to make sure. What happens is that a lot of the people whose bodies are taken tend to be poor. They often tend to be people of color, and because they don't have advocates. And it's been nice to see that over the last however many years, there's been a lot of change in how universities deal with donated bodies. Funeral homes and stuff are still less regulated, but that's coming to the fore a bit too. And one of the most interesting things for me, my father's a doctor, and I decided early on I didn't want to be a doctor. He wasn't a bad doctor, but a lot of his patients died because he was a hematologist oncologist. And it seemed to take an awful lot out of him. And we never really talked much about it. But when I was doing the research here for this, it was natural to ask him a lot of questions. And he told me that I hadn't known, but he took a year off of medical school to do, just to do autopsies, because he wanted to learn about the human body. And so it was pretty fascinating. Some of the knowledge he imparted to me made its way in here, but more than that, it was a nice way actually to get to know my dad in a way that I hadn't. And one of the pleasures of writing is that the universe sort of provides you things that you didn't know were going to come your way if you're paying attention when you're writing a book. So I hope a lot of that is in here, and I hope if you guys got to read it, I don't know if I would say you enjoyed it, but you were moved by it, you were maybe fascinated by it. And I'd be happy to answer any questions you have about the book, the writing process, etc., writing in general. So, anyone have any questions? Yes?
Is this based on anything like real that happened event-wise, or is it pulled from different things, or is it just 100%?
Imagination?
Yeah.
It's nothing that happened in my life. I'm not a writer. A lot of writers write from their own lives, and I almost never do. In part because when I was younger, I wrote a short story about a great uncle who I really loved. He taught me how to score baseball games and all kinds of things. And I thought it was a really nice story. And he was a man of few words, and he sent me a letter when he read it, and it said, "I will never speak to you again." And I realized that he didn't think the same thing about that story I did. So I wrote him a long, like 7-page letter. We actually, we were fine. But it spooked me, and I decided from that point I'm not touching anything too close to home, which has actually been good, because it's meant that my imagination is sort of free to roam wherever. What it often means, though, and like with the German woman, which was set in World War I and World War II, it took me 10 years because I had to do so much research. I had to do a lot of research for this. It's based on real things in the sense that this stuff happens all the time. I don't know, as far as I know, none of the things I've referenced have actually happened here in Louisville, but one way or the other, they've happened around the country. I mean, I don't take, like, it's not like Law and Order, where, ripped from the headlines kind of thing. But in the research, you sort of get a feel for what the world is like. The characters aren't people I know; they're not based on anybody. So it's that sort of weird, like nothing actually happened, but all of it is plausible because these kind of things happen all the time, which I've discovered in my research. So that's a pretty long answer to a short question, but I hope it's satisfactory. Hi, yeah.
Do you think possibly the subject fascinated you because of your father's reticence to talking about what he was dealing with?
I think probably. My father is an identical twin, and I'm the father of twins, so I'm the son and father of twins. And the day that I've always remembered he came home just looking awful, it turned out was the day he lost a twin. Not his brother, but a patient who was a twin. And I knew, it's interesting because from a very early age, I knew my father's primary relationship was with his twin brother, whose name was John. I'm Paul, my dad's Paul. And my dad routinely called me John. He would say, John this, John that. And they were very different people. My father was the chairman of the American College of Physicians. He spent most of his career fighting for a national health care plan. He and his brother John were at Harvard. Their classmate was Teddy Kennedy, and they worked with Teddy to try and get a national health care plan. My dad did. My uncle John was a right-wing venture capitalist who thought Rush Limbaugh was a communist. I mean, he was so right-wing, it was crazy. They were nothing alike. My dad is not in any way spiritual, but I was sitting with him once when I was about 13, and he stood up and his face turned white. He said, "I gotta call John, something happened." And John was 600 miles away in Chicago, and he literally just cut his finger off with an axe. He was chopping wood. So I had this really strange and powerful connection, which I've actually seen in my twins too. My twins, for the first 3 years, they didn't speak English. They had their own language. And my father and my uncle were like that. And that sense of twinship was important to me, and it was really important to my dad as a doctor. That loss of that twin is the one he still talks about. My dad's still alive, he's 90. And he still talks about that day, and I remember it too. So yeah, I'm sure that did. We talk a little bit about medical stuff, but not too much. But it's a way to sort of find out about a world that I was close to but never actually in an odd way. So yeah, that's a very good question. I hadn't really thought about it that way, but I'm sure you're right. Others?
As a writer, when you do write about dark material, does it stay with you after you're finished?
Yes, absolutely. Sometimes it's a little hard to distinguish why it stays with you, and sometimes it isn't. Since we're talking about happy themes, my most recently published novel is called The Book of Otto and Liam, and it's about a father, Otto, and his son Liam, who had been wounded in a school shooting. Despite that, and what happens in the book, over the course of the book, he's in the neuro ICU for a long time. The book for me is hopeful. It's about family and love and trying to overcome horrible things. And despite me having said recently, I basically never write from life, there's a good part of that book that actually is from life. I was on my 52nd birthday, and I was waiting for my daughter to call. She was in New York City, and she didn't call, which was odd because we were really close. And at 2 a.m. the phone rang, and it was the New York State Police telling me that my daughter had been in a car accident. She was in the hospital and she might live. That was literally all they told me. And literally while I was talking to the guy, the phone rang, another number came up and it was the hospital. So I hung up on the cop and talked to them. She had 47 broken bones, damaged organs, a traumatic brain injury. I got a call at 2 a.m. I was on the phone. I was on the plane at 7. I was at her bedside at 11. And when I got there, she was a mess. She'd already had one surgery, but her face was all covered with blood. She still had leaves in her hair because the car had broken open and stuff. And I didn't know where I could touch her, because so the nurse said you can touch her toe. So I touched her toe, and she was warm, and that was good. They told us she would never walk, that she would never have a job, and she was 6 weeks away from graduating from NYU. She'd gone through it, and she was a star, and she coded while I was there. She died. I brought her back, and then it happened again. I brought her back, and this is a happy ending story. They told her she would never work, never walk. She came back here. She went to Fraser. She learned to walk. She learned to talk. She learned to read. She's about 95% back. She has a fantastic job in New York City. She lives with a partner. She's amazing. And little quirks here and there, like if you looked at the clock and it was noon, you said, "What time is it?" She would know it's 12, and she would tell you it's 1. And she'd know that was wrong, and she'd say, it's 11. She'd know that was wrong, and she'd say it's 12. Most people wouldn't think much about it. She goes through the metal detector, like the thing downstairs, the thing goes crazy. She's like the bionic woman. She's all metal. But mostly she's really good. And we got lucky. We got phenomenally lucky. And she, to be fair, she fought like hell. She's an amazing woman. But we got lucky, and we all know it. She has zero memory of it from about 10 minutes before the accident to about 8 weeks later when I brought her home from the neuro ICU, which was a terrible place to be because everybody in there has had like a stroke or a gunshot or whatever. But there were also some really funny, weird moments. Like at one point I was asked, because you know, you get to know the people in there, I was asked to witness the making of a will for a woman who was Russian. She was a nanny who had come here and etc. So I went in and, you know, they asked me because I happened to be the warm body standing there, so I'm like, okay. So they read this this will off, and it's all in Russian. And like every, you know, 2 minutes they look at me, and I'm like, okay. And then, you know, they went on for about 5 minutes, and at the end they said, you sign here. So I signed there, and then afterwards I'm like, did I just like sign this woman's like wealth over to a, you know, some mob group? No idea. Carrie said some things that when she came out of her coma at one point, they were rolling her on her side because they had to change a bracelet they had on her. And they said to her beforehand, Carrie, this is gonna hurt when we roll you on your side. So they rolled her on her side, and she said, yeah, okay, Einstein, who the hell taught you medical school stuff? This doesn't hurt, it's fucking killing me. And I thought, okay, she's coming back. She also had no filter. When she came home, it was right around Christmas time, and her brothers, her younger brothers, her twin brothers, spent a lot of time trying to figure out what they would buy her for Christmas. So they bought her a Keurig coffee maker. They thought, this is great, you know, she has an apartment, etc. And they gave it to her. And because the injury was to her frontal lobe, she didn't have any inhibitions at all. And they were really excited, and she opens the present, she looks at it, and she says, this is the dumbest fucking gift anyone has ever given me. And they were shocked. They were so upset because they worked so hard on it. And we hadn't told them how bad her injuries were because we didn't want to scare them. And so afterwards I realized, okay, this is the time where you sit down and explain what actually happened to your older sister. When I came to write the book, Otto and Leo, almost all the stuff in the neuro ICU where the boy is after he's been wounded came from my experiences in the neuro ICU. Some were funny, most were terrifying, some were completely bewildering. Before I wrote that book, which was about 7 or 8 years after my daughter's accident, I had not slept through the night since the accident. And it wasn't like I would wake up and think, oh, Carrie's in danger. I would always wake up in the middle of the night, and then I would just not go back to sleep. And after I wrote the book, I started sleeping through the night again. So in that way, the book changed me. It still lingered, and in a good way, in the sense that I got to sleep finally. But some of the darker stuff in that book has stayed with me too, about school shootings. I have to say, whenever there's news about a school shooting, I have to turn it off now, because I did a lot of research into the families of victims, but more specifically into the hoaxers, the people who think it's all, you know, a government false flag to take their guns away and stuff. And the stuff they do, they show up at people's houses, and they show up at their jobs, and they say, you're a liar, your kid never existed. It's a level of cruelty, it's almost impossible to imagine. And that's really stayed with me. It results in real anger whenever I see a school shooting. I mean, they're appalling to begin with, but knowing some of the stuff that floats in the wake of those things, that stays with me in ways I wish it didn't. On the other hand, there are things that stay with me that are really powerful and life affirming. That, you know, I've researched or met people, or that my novel, The German Woman, is in an odd way one of my proudest moments. Was I had, I gave a reading, and there were question and answer period, and this elderly woman in the back raised her hand. She had a very thick German accent, and she said, "What are your memories of World War II?" And I said, "Well, I was born a long time after it ended, so I really don't have any." Went on with the other questions, and she came up afterwards, and in the book there's a scene, the firebombing of Hamburg, and I'd done a lot of research on it, and she came up and she said, she asked me to sign her book, and then she said, "I was a little girl in Hamburg when that firebombing happened, and when I came to that spot in your book, I had to put it down." And I thought she was telling me that I did a shitty job, that I didn't get it right. So I said, "Look, I'm sorry, I did a lot of research, I tried to make it as realistic as I could," and she put her hand on my arm, she stopped, she said, "No, you got it right." And it made me remember it all, and I have to thank you for that. Which stung me, part of me was like, "Oh, that's great, except do you really want to be remembered?" So it was kind of an odd thing. But there are other moments like that. So writing changes you in really profound and subtle ways sometimes. And I guess the best thing about it is you come to realize that writing isn't, it'll sound odd, it's not the books and stories and screenplays and stuff you produce. It's the whole process. There's almost a Zen thing to actually sitting down and just doing it day after day after day, which is kind of meditative. It can be lonely because you're in a room by yourself, but in the end, it also it can help you endure a lot of things. So I'm really grateful to have had the chance to be able to write. I'm lucky. I know a lot of people would love to and can't for various reasons. There's a good deal of luck in getting published. Why they picked me and not someone else. Somebody was in a good mood the day they read my manuscript, right? I think I'm a good writer. Hell, I think I'm a really good writer. But there's a lot of really good writers. And so you take from that some gratitude. Again, another really long answer to a question, but I hope a good one. Others?
Obviously, you put a lot of research into this, and you said that you talked to your father. You said you watched a lot of YouTube videos. What other types of research? Because you get really scientific about the body parts and all of the.
Yeah. Well, I had to talk not just to my dad, but doctors and nurses who because you want to get it right.
Right.
You don't want because believe me, I get letters if I get things wrong or emails or whatever, and I'm not going to read another one of your books. And okay. Sorry, I got it wrong. So you try and do it. But I also read a lot of books. There are some memoirs by former body brokers. So if you're interested, send me an email. I'll send you a list. It's pretty interesting to read how they get into the business and what they do and what it does to them. I'm a pretty obsessive researcher. I actually love the research part. And it can be a problem as a writer because when you're researching, you're telling yourself you're writing, but you're not really writing what you're researching. And researching is really interesting because like sometimes when I was writing the book, I'd come to a thing like, I don't know how you disambiguate an elbow or whatever, disarticulate. So I would just write the scene and then I would go research. But there were also times in my research that I would all of a sudden be like, the scene would bloom in your mind because it wasn't something you had thought about beforehand. So the research works both ways, and so it's important to try and get it right, but it can also serve as a real creative spur, which is part of the reason doing it so much is particularly pleasurable. Yeah.
I was curious about the publication that you mentioned, Otto Liam. I think that's published by Sarah
Yep.
here in Louisville.
Yep.
And then this book was Soft Skull Press in New York City.
Yep.
What, do you have a manager that shops the book, or?
I have an agent who's a fantastic agent, and like most writers, she's not my first agent. Sort of through odd circumstances, we ended up together. She's about my age, and unlike a lot of agents, she really loves literature. Most agents are just like, give me the money and move on. So she's actually my first reader. When I finish something, I send it to her, and she's tough. She's couple of my books, she's just said, no, not good enough, not gonna do it. Others, she'll say, yeah, I think this is good, but you need to do X, Y, and Z. Others, she'll just take it and say, yep, that's great, I'm gonna go out with it. And then she shops it. So she sold my first 2 books to Random House, also New York. Then the third one to Houghton Mifflin in Boston. And then this one to Soft Skull, and the last 2 to Saravan. She also does short stories, and the way agents work is you don't pay them. They take a percentage. In my case, she takes 15% of whatever the sales are. Any sales to movies or overseas, she takes 20% because she splits it 10% with herself and 10% with the movie agent or the foreign person. And she's relentless. I had a story published in Oprah about a year ago, which I'd written like 12 years ago, and she always loved it, but she could never sell it, but she just kept sending it out, and eventually Oprah took it. So a good agent makes a big difference. It's essentially impossible to get a novel published now if you don't have an agent. When I started, most big publishers had somebody to read slush pile stuff. They don't have that anymore. So you have to have an agent. And it's gotten more and more sort of business like now. Most writers have contracts with agents. They specify, I'll send your work out X amount of times per month or whatever until it either sells or, we've gone through all the publishers. I don't have a contract with her. Everything's verbal, and we're good friends. But it's a big business. I mean, Nicole, my agent, she's Colson Whitehead, Juno Diaz, a bunch of writers who won the National Book Award, the Pulitzer Prize, the Booker Prize, and it was luck that we started out together. And I'm very happy to have her, and also to have her as a friend. But most writers have agents. If you look in the back, most writers think they're agents. And I've like the editor, most editors I've never actually met. Right, you work through the mail or email or whatever. And she's sold my work overseas to a bunch of places, and everything just comes through her. Anybody else got time for like one more question?
Yeah, it's about 12:34.
Yeah.
As far as like themes or styles of your book, do you think you take inspiration from any particular author?
Boy, we could be here a long time for that. So one of my first loves was The Great Gatsby by Fitzgerald. When I read that book, that's actually when I wanted to decide I wanted to be a writer. I was 16. I was bored, picked up the book, and afterwards I was like, wow, if I could move anybody the way that book moved me, I'll have done something with my life. Then I read everything, and my tastes are pretty broad. I love Jane Austen, which you would of course know from reading this book, right? Because it's so Jane Austen. Flannery O'Connor, Song of Solomon, Toni Morrison. A lot of the South American writers, Brazilians especially. I read and translated a bunch of Portuguese writers. There's a great novel by a guy named John Dos Passos. 3 novels called the USA Trilogy. They sort of span from about 1910 to 1930. So World War I and all the way up through the Great Depression and stuff. And they're really experimental. They have little mini biographies and newspaper headlines and all kinds of other weird things sort of woven throughout, and especially in my most recent book, the Book of Otto and Liam. I've loved that book for like 30 years, and Otto and Liam is much more experimental. There's drawings and headlines and bullet points and chapters where characters do things. That Otto is an artist, which is why they're the drawings. So some of the books I've read and loved, I can tell you what the influences are, and others I can't. But I read all the time, and even now, when I read a book, I write about it afterwards. What I liked, what I didn't, what I think the writer did well. I still take books apart like a car mechanic takes apart engines to figure out how somebody does something, especially things I don't think I'm good enough at yet, even after 6 books. So there's just a long list of writers I love.
You know, I'm tickled to hear you say about Dos Pasos. I can't remember either 1919 or the big money.
Right.
Has a scene in Cherokee Park here.
Yes, it does. Yeah, that's right, I
It's-
forgot about that.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for
All
coming.
right, thank you guys very much, I'm sorry I'm a little short, but I hope it was good for you guys, and this is a great thing, so thanks for having me. Anybody has any questions that I didn't get to, or, you know, anything else about writing or whatever, please write me, you know, my email's right at the University of Louisville, it's just paul.griner@louisville.edu, and I'll be happy to answer, okay?
Will you let us know when your next book comes out?
I will,
Okay.
I will.
Check out.
All right,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very